through the tenure of 3 commandants. Today, we will hear from the 26th Coast Guard Commandant on the status of a decade-old modernization program and his vision for the future of this program and the service. Modernization is especially important as the Coast Guard faces some unique challenges, increasing cyber threats, growing maritime transportation in the Arctic with limited infrastructure, while also working to complement its assets with emerging technologies to conduct its 11 statutory missions. In tandem with the modernization program, the service is undertaking a multi-decade recapitalization of aging assets, the replacement of vessels, aircraft, and shore infrastructure. The Coast Guard is nearing completion of production on the national security cutters and fast response cutters, while ramping up efforts on the offshore patrol cutters and starting construction on the first vessel in new polar icebreaking fleet. Successfully acquiring new and relevant assets is essential to a modern and responsive Coast Guard. As it modernizes its fleets of assets, the Coast Guard needs to determine its manpower needs. New assets may not have the personnel needs of old assets, while emerging technologies might also allow for more efficient placement and usage of Coast Guard personnel. How the Coast Guard brings all of these parts together is important to the success of the service efficiently and effectively conducting its missions and supporting its service members. As we near the end of another active hurricane season, we see the Coast Guard at the front lines of the response efforts to our nation's emergencies. We are grateful for the Coast Guard servicemen and women who have contributed to the response and the recovery efforts. I just got to witness those efforts personally down in North Carolina. These events remind us that the continued successes of the Coast Guard is reliant on an effective and efficient modernization plan that is implemented by trained personnel using capable assets and technology. In Florida, we are familiar with the significant role of the Coast Guard in responding to national emergencies and disaster. I'd like to recognize Admiral Schultz. Many active duty service tours in Florida, his service down there, including most recently as the Director of Operations for U.S. Southern Command and the Commander of the Coast Guard sector in Miami. Very close to home for me. I thank Admiral Schultz for being here today, and I look forward to hearing his thoughts on these issues. I will now yield to Ranking Member Garamendi for 5 minutes to make an opening statement that he may have.
Mr. Chairman, delighted to sit next to you. Congratulations on assuming this task and the importance of the Coast Guard, as you well know. So I look forward to working with you. And we've had a good session with our previous chair, and I'm sure it'll be repeated in your tenure as chair of this committee. So welcome and congratulations. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge and welcome Admiral Schultz to the committee for his first opportunity to testify as the 26th Commandant of the Coast Guard. Good morning and welcome. You've sat in that chair before, but in a different role. The Coast Guard has now endured some tumultuous times, especially having to respond and cope with the aftermath of 3 consecutive devastating hurricanes last year, and most recently, Hurricane Florence and the Carolinas. So the Coast Guard's been busy, and your command, here you go. I commend the men and women of the Coast Guard for their stellar response to these disasters and for the unfailing ability to remain semper paratus, always ready. Whenever, wherever, you're always good to go. The Coast Guard also has to contend with other serious challenges, those of human-induced variety, that either diminish or erode the Coast Guard's capabilities and missions readiness. And I'd like to explore some of those this morning. For example, I've advocated for years that to sustain the Coast Guard at a level to meet the demands that we have placed on it, we must invest. We have insufficient investments to ensure that the Coast Guard service members have the assets, the training, and the support they need to get the job done, and done quickly and correctly. Consequently, I commend the administration. Consequently, I commended the administration earlier this year when it requested for the Coast Guard in its fiscal 2018 budget a $1.1 billion or 11% increase over the fiscal 17 enacted level. Considering the administration's abysmal fiscal 2017 budget request, which was a cut of $1.3 billion or 14%, which fortunately didn't happen, I thought that we had turned a corner. I'm not so sure that my optimism was justified and may very well have been premature. Earlier this summer, word leaked out that the administration was looking to transfer funds from agencies within the Homeland Security Department, including the Coast Guard, to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, in order to fund the administration's highly controversial, if not inhumane, family separation and deportation activities on the southern border. A Transportation and Infrastructure Committee ranking member, Peter DeFazio, and I wrote to OMB Director Mick Mulvaney, urging him in the strongest possible terms to not transfer funds from the Coast Guard and certainly not shortchange the Coast Guard further as the hurricane season was approaching. Well, it appears as though our pleas fell on deaf ears. With no notice to the members of this committee, OMB cut roughly $32.1 million from the Coast Guard's budget, an amount roughly equivalent to the entire Coast Guard budgets for both research and development and environmental compliance and restoration. Admiral Schultz, I want to hear from you where that $32 million came from, what it means to the Coast Guard. Moreover, I will want to learn the impact on your programs. Aside from trying to provide a stable budget for the Coast Guard, the service also must confront new maritime challenges facing our nation. As the Arctic warms more quickly, then we'll have little as 5 to 10 years to get this job done. We're talking icebreakers, we're talking the high north, and what the strategy is for the Arctic as well as the Antarctic. Fortunately, we've made some progress on the recapitalization of the Coast Guard's fleet of heavy icebreakers. That's good news. The bad news, however, delivered recently by the Government Accounting Office, indicates that perhaps the Coast Guard's business case for the acquisition of the lead ship's Coast Guard icebreakers has serious risks, especially with certain design assumptions and an over-optimistic schedule. I'm not sure I agree with the GAO. I'd love to hear your view on this, Mr. Admiral Schultz. We need to find out if the Coast Guard agrees with those recommendations. These are just two issues that are immediately spring to mind. There are others, and we'll get to those in the Q&A. In closing, Admiral Schultz, you've assumed command at a critical juncture in the Coast Guard's history, a time when the service is midstream in the most expensive and far-reaching recapitalization in its history, while simultaneously being forced to stay ahead of the many turbulent, shifting economic security challenges as well as the environmental challenges that confront not only the Coast Guard but the world. Admiral Schultz, your call to build a Coast Guard that is ready, relevant, and responsive, the 3 R's, is both admirable and aspirational. Moreover, such principles are completely on target with the demands that you have acquired and inherited as the 26th Commandant. It's my expectation that you will infuse those principles into the Coast Guard during your watch, and to that end, we'll help you. Thank you. Yield back.
Our witness today is Admiral Carl L. Schultz, who assumed duties of the 26th Commandant of the Coast Guard in June 2018. I ask unanimous consent that our witness' full statement be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. Since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee would request that you limit your oral testimony to no longer than 5 minutes. Admiral Schultz, you are recognized to give your statement.
Good morning, Chairman Mass, Ranking Member Garamendi, distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to address you as the 26th Commandant for my first time. Our United States Coast Guard safeguards the American people and promotes economic prosperity. Our leadership and presence spans from the Arctic to the Persian Gulf to our inland waterway system. As challenges to our national security and global influence grow more complex, the need for a ready, relevant, and responsive Coast Guard has never been greater. Looking back at the transformative changes that have taken place within the Coast Guard over the last 15 to 20 years, it is clear that our efforts to modernize the service have been effective. Today, we employed a unified command structure. We speak with one voice on mission strategy, utilize progressive business practices, and have made tremendous strides in our financial management, acquisitions, and human capital processes. Moving forward, our soon-to-be-released strategic plan captures my vision for the service over the next 4 years, supports Department of Homeland Security objectives and the national security strategy. Our lines of effort will emphasize our investment in service readiness while fine-tuning mission execution and operational support to meet the needs and demands of the nation. Maximizing readiness today and into the future is my top priority, and our people are the cornerstone of service readiness. We must recruit, support, and retain what I term a mission-ready total workforce that not only positions the service to excel across our full spectrum of missions, but also represents the diverse nation we serve. While readiness starts with our service members, we must also modernize key capabilities and assets. With the support of the administration and the Congress, we continue to build momentum on our recapitalization efforts, including our highest priorities, the offshore patrol cutter and the polar security cutter. Beyond surface recapitalization, we must also invest in reliable C5I enterprise systems and buy down a shore infrastructure backlog that currently exceeds $1.6 billion, both of which are critical to our frontline operations and the operators. While improving the readiness of our armed forces has been the focus of recent budgetary increases, our Coast Guard, one of the 5 armed services, has not received a comparable increase in our operations and support funding, which is crucial to keeping our modern assets on the water and operating at full capacity. A mission-ready total workforce, coupled with sufficiently resourced assets, modern systems, and resilient infrastructure, will enable our Coast Guard to address the nation's complex maritime challenges. Our maritime border to the south is being exploited by violent transnational criminal organizations, and the Coast Guard is a key component of a comprehensive approach to border security. We tackle threats before they reach our shores. In fiscal year 2017, the Coast Guard interdicted 223 metric tons, that's 490,000 pounds, of illegal narcotics and transferred 606 smugglers to the Department of Justice for prosecution here in the United States. These efforts promote regional stability in the Central American corridor and deter illegal immigration at our southern land border. Our Coast Guard bridges the gap where Homeland Security and Homeland Defense intersect. We seamlessly integrate into today's joint force, supporting the Department of Defense across the globe, typically at 5 of the 6 geographic combatant commander regions on a near-daily basis. For example, since 2003, a fleet of Coast Guard 6 Island-class patrol boats have provided vital support to the Central Command Commander in Southwest and Southeast Asia, conducting maritime security operations on the Arabian Gulf. The Coast Guard also leverages partnerships with maritime stakeholders to facilitate the safe and efficient transit of commerce, contributing $4.6 trillion annually to our nation's economy. The marine transportation system, a vital latticework of waterways and seaports, is highly dependent on a complex, globally networked system of automated technologies, one always vulnerable to today's cyber disruptions. As the nation's maritime first responder, Americans trust their Coast Guard to thrive in crisis and recovery. And we will continue to deliver excellence anytime, anywhere. Less than 2 weeks ago, the nation once again witnessed the Coast Guard's bias for action and operational agility. After Hurricane Florence made landfall, almost 3,000 Coast Guard responders engaged in search and rescue efforts, saving almost 1,000 lives. As technology advances, global competition surges, our adversaries become more sophisticated, and the maritime environment more complex. Our Coast Guard provides solutions from cooperation to armed conflict. As noted in my introduction, the demand for Coast Guard services has never been greater. I look forward to working with this committee to ensure our Coast Guard remains always ready to meet the maritime challenges of our great nation. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Admiral Schultz. I will now recognize members for 5 minutes of questioning, beginning with myself. And again, I do thank you for your service. It was an honor to see your men and women out there on the ground in North Carolina doing their work. It was incredible to see, and they were making a difference in the lives of the people that I got to speak to in and around the communities. I would like to touch off a little bit on what's going on with property and significant real property portfolio that requires constant maintenance and management that the Coast Guard has. Through modernization, you have established the Shore Infrastructure Logistics Center in order to enhance the acquisition, maintenance, alteration, refurbishment, and disposal of shore facilities in order to enable the Coast Guard's mission execution. However, much of the legacy shore infrastructure management structure, including civil engineering units, which operate outside of the standard district and area of geographical constraints, those remain in place. We understand that your civil engineers remain responsible for not only construction and maintenance, but also overall management of the real property portfolio. So this is where I wanted to ask, how do you plan to continue to modernize and enhance the Coast Guard's shore infrastructure management in order to maximize the usage of existing space, more efficiently and more effectively spend that limited funding that is available?
Well, thank you, Chairman, for the question. We do work our real property, our facilities, through our Shore Infrastructure Logistics Service Center. That is part of our modernized efforts where essentially we have a holistic across-the-service look. In past years, we were, in pre-modernized Coast Guard, we would look through regional commanders, the Atlantic Command, the Pacific Command, down through the 9 districts. Now we have a holistic look. I think we make decisions that are enterprise decisions that take across risks that allow us to put finite dollars against the most pressing capital projects. We do have, as I mentioned, a shoreside backlog that exceeds $1.6 billion. The supplemental dollars that the Congress awarded us in 2017, in the 2018 time frame to make right after Hurricane Matthew and deal with it in 16 and deal with the 2017 hurricane season, injected a good chunk of monies on top of the work that was ongoing for actual repairs, some resiliency money. That has been very helpful. That brought down about $100 million of that backlog, and the backlog has grown. It remains about 1.6, but it was really on a trajectory to 1.7 billion. I will tell you today, Chairman, I believe our modernized enterprise is in a better situation. We're looking to bring on a senior individual to help manage that infusion of monies. Our shore infrastructure, we had some reductions in bodies in that space. So we are bringing someone in to make sure we execute the funds that Congress allocated to us in terms of supplements for the hurricanes and get after our ongoing challenges and what's been, I hate to use the term, a bit of a neglected space, but organizations make choices, and we've been funded at a Budget Control Act level here the last 7 or 8 years, and we haven't got the shore infrastructure dollars we need, but we have seen an uptick there. I will continue to talk about that in my appearances before you and on the Senate side in the months ahead.
And Admiral, speaking of those constraints that you mentioned, how do you actually foresee rationalizing the service's existing holdings into a more coherent, more easily managed portfolio based on the Coast Guard's mission needs, rather than what you might be able to call a mishmash of legacy properties currently owned by the Coast Guard? I've seen it worked on a number of different fronts, to include in my area, properties that just haven't been used for very long periods of time, maybe don't even have any infrastructure on them whatsoever. How do you foresee rationalizing that?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to actually get back to you, maybe give your team a brief on that. We constantly are looking at those, and it's the puts and takes. There are those legacy properties that arguably may have not been addressed sufficiently or in a timely fashion, as you see as you sit in your Florida congressional district, versus the incoming work, and there's a finite amount of human capacity to get after those challenges. We are aware of those. We're tracking those. Probably best if I could defer that to maybe come in and brief your staff and give you some of the specifics. I'm not well positioned today to tell you, across the country where those are. But we constantly look at that inventory. We constantly, and I think we do that more effectively today. Arguably, do we do it as effectively as this committee would like from an oversight perspective? There's probably some room for improvement there.
Thank you, Admiral. I did also want to ask, when recapitalization is actually complete, the Coast Guard will have over 15,000 less major cutter operational hours than it did just 15 years ago. And we're looking at the increasing mission sets. So while modern cutters, they may be more capable, less operational hours will mean less coverage. So in order to bridge that projected capability gap, the Coast Guard would need 4 additional national security cutters, more than 4 offshore patrol cutters. So how do you see the Coast Guard continuing to respond to increasing demands despite that capability gap?
Well, Mr. Chairman, as I think you know, the program of record for the National Security Cutter was 8 vessels. The 2018 Omnibus actually funds a 10th and 11th National Security Cutter. One version of the appropriations bill for 2019 that is under deliberations by the Congress right now includes long lead time potentially for a 12th National Security Cutter. So we did get more National Security Cutters than the program of record, which will bite into a little bit of that shortfall you speak to. We're very encouraged. I think we'll be announcing this week a production award for the first OPC and long lead materials for number 2. That is a program of record of 25 ships. Obviously, the Congress will have an opportunity to weigh in if they think 25 ships is the appropriate number. We're well into the build-out of 58 fast response cutters. The fast response cutters are proving significantly more capable than the 110-foot island-class cutters they replace. A fast response cutter is 154 feet over the waterline versus 110 feet. It has a stern launch boat. It has highly sophisticated C5 ISR capability. So that vessel, we just pushed one out of Hawaii past Guam, 2,000 miles away. We couldn't do that with an island-class patrol boat yesteryear. So I think what we are seeing, and we're just starting to get our arms and brains around, is just how more capable these assets are. That national security cutter is able to contribute and process national-level security, and on the water, we're just amazed almost daily about what that ship is capable to do in the fight on drugs. We rolled a national security cutter into San Juan Harbor during the response to Hurricane Irma. It's essentially, we moved our command and control node from shore that was damaged onto that national security cutter and didn't miss a beat. So I think there is a conversation there about just how much more capable the new assets are versus just solely focusing on the number of hours.
Very good, Admiral. I appreciate your response to my questions. I will now recognize Mr. Garamendi for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, let's start with the $34 million or so that was transferred. Where did it come from? What does it mean to the operations of the Coast Guard that you have $34 million less, or maybe even more than 34? Bring us up to date. Where'd the money, where was it taken from your budget to transfer to ICE? What does that mean to your operations?
Well, Ranking Member Garamendi, yes, in fact, there was about a $32+ million transfer. What I would say, sir, is that without consequences? Absolutely not. You know, in an organization that takes every dollar supported by the taxpayer towards, I think what I'd say is goodness for the nation, obviously every nickel matters. But in this case, I would say we have the maneuver space. Reprogrammings are a typical part of budgets. We are one of 22 agencies that sit within the Department of Homeland Security. As I've been in and out of Washington the last 15, 20 years of my life, I'm not sure I've seen a budget cycle where there hasn't been a reprogramming in the department the Coast Guard has sat in, whether that was the Department of Transportation of yesteryear or DHS today. That said, sir, I think to answer in response to your question, I think we take some shortages on spare parts. Some of it goes towards, you know, efforts to support shore infrastructure recapitalization in terms of the execution of that. There's consequence, but it's manageable. I will assure you it has not diminished our ability to respond to frontline operations such as recent Hurricane Florence response operations and recovery operations.
So you're saying it wasn't terribly important and therefore we can take $34 million out of next year's budget?
Sir, I'm not saying that taking a dollar from the Coast Guard budget isn't important. I would say, you know, as an operating organization, as a component under a larger department with broad-ranging duties spread across 22 components, it's a part of, I guess, existing in this town.
You've been involved in Hurricane Florence recovery?
Sir, I will tell you quite with great certainty, it did not diminish our ability to respond to Hurricane Florence in any capacity.
What was the daily cost of the search and rescue in the Florence?
Sure, I don't have a number. I would say our search and rescue costs are rolled into our ops and support. Our budget model, as you know, is very complicated because of our multi-mission nature. But we surged 27 aircraft essentially operating out of the Carolinas. We had 11 fixed-wing aircraft. We surged, you know, upwards of 3,000 Coast Guard men and women. We had the maneuver space in our budget, sir, to do that without any diminution of capability or capacity.
And Florence is the last hurricane this year?
Sir, the chairman talked about as the season drove towards an end here. It's pretty early in the year, and typically we're on high alert till the end of the hurricane season in 30 November, sir. So we're paying a lot of attention to the Atlantic Basin activity.
You will be able to develop and deliver to this committee the average daily cost of those 27 aircraft and 30,000 personnel that were involved in Florence?
Yes, sir, 3,000, but we will deliver that back to you, Mr. Rankin.
The average daily cost?
Yes, sir.
I would appreciate that. I suspect there'll be another hurricane, and that $34 million is coming out of something.
Aye, Mr. Garamendi. Got it.
Okay. Potomac River security closings. Big hullabaloo about that. Last in 2017, Admiral Zumkov said that the eastern river would not be, the eastern side of the Potomac would not be closed whenever the president arrived on the western side. Those closings, I am told, are now that the east is closed and the west is closed whenever the president's at his golf course. Could you bring us up to date on the current policy?
Yes, sir. And Ranking Member Garamendi, regarding the river closure, there is a river closure when the president is at the Trump National Golf Course there, but there is what I would say is a reasonable accommodation. We provide security at the behest of the U.S. Secret Service for presidential security. They have asked us to mitigate the risks on that waterway. I understand there's an ongoing lawsuit filed here recently, earlier this month. There is a mechanism by which kayakers, canoers, other waterway users can contact Sector Maryland National Capital Region. They can request a pass-through. I believe that area is served by cellular phone where there should be a means to reach the sector. We are aware, and there's some frustration that, you know, the final rule went into effect, and there's been comments after that. We are sensitive to those comments. We will reach back to waterway users, understand suggested alternatives, and look at that. But obviously, first and foremost, as an operating agency of the government, we respond to the U.S. Secret Service request to support the president from a security standpoint.
36 times you've closed the river?
Sir, I'm not sure the exact number. There's a significant number of times, but there is a means, what I would say, I think is a reasonable combination for folks to transit through that section of the river. It's about a 2-mile stretch of the river that's impacted.
Apparently, that's not the case now, that your current policy is to close the river completely.
Mr. Garamendi, I'll get back to you. The closure with no pass-through is not my understanding of the circumstances, but I will circle back, sir, with you or your staff and clarify that if I am mistaken on that.
If you would, please.
Yes, sir.
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi. The chair will now recognize Mr. Weber for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Admiral. Congratulations, I think. So it was good to see you. I really appreciated y'all's response during Hurricane Harvey back along our district. For the members of the committee that may not know, I have the first 3 coastal counties in Texas starting at Louisiana, so we were ground zero for Harvey flooding. And let me just tell you, the Coast Guard got in gear, and it was amazing what they did. And Admiral, you were there, and I appreciated y'all's efforts very greatly. And so this discussion about Congressman Garamendi moving $34 million out is of interest to me because I've seen you all up close and personal and what you do and how important it is. And so I appreciate that, John, your questioning there. Admiral, what is the total budget of the Coast Guard? Do you know offhand?
Mr. Weber, Congressman Weber, our total budget, discretionary, non-discretionary, is a little bit north of $12 billion here. That was the high water mark for the Coast Guard here coming out of the FY18 omnibus budget.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned in your comments the modernization has fundamentally altered the system. And so I want you to talk about that a little bit. Good, bad, and different. Can you affect that change? You mentioned several things in your comments about how it has altered the way that you work together, the different facets of the Coast Guard. But you're seeing a lot of storms Congressman Garamendi was asking you about, and I'm really a little disappointed that you wouldn't guarantee him no more hurricanes, you know. But when you say fundamentally altered, as the new commandant, good, bad, and different, I know modernization has helped. Are you able to affect that, be more cohesive? Describe that for us. Your mic's not on, I don't think.
I thank you for the question, Congressman Weber, and I would say absolutely it has been positive across the board. It is fundamentally a different approach to how we do business. Probably 2 of the large pieces, if you look at how we work here in Washington, our Deputy Commandant for Operations looks strategically at operations policy across the entire Coast Guard. That's coast to coast, that's our international, global operations. Our Deputy Commandant for Mission Support has adopted the best of what was originally our aviation model, where we had an operations level and a depot level maintenance model. We have visibility on our assets from acquiring of new assets until we retire them, typically many, many years, for the Coast Guard, usually decades later. We have visibility on those. I'll give you an example on the maintenance side. So the 270-foot medium endurance class ship, which we have 13 of, we built them in the mid-'80s. They're 30-plus years old. In the past, we would have an engineering unit in Portsmouth, Virginia, where we have 5 of those ships home ported, that would do maintenance there. And we had 3 ships in Boston, and then another naval engineering unit that would do maintenance there, a couple in Key West, a couple in Maine. They were different. They didn't have visibility across the budget for the entire service for that type of ship. Today we have a product line that manages all 13 of those 270-foot ships. We are making enterprise choices, given finite amounts of dollars, to say, all right, across that fleet, what has to be done today to put as many of those ships in the fight as many days as possible across a given calendar year? I would argue we are exponentially more strategic. We're allocating taxpayer dollars in a much more sophisticated and purposeful fashion. The equipment, our acquisition processes, under mission support, acquisitions resides, human capital resides, all those enabling functions that allow us to have a Coast Guard that's ready, relevant, responsive that I talk about through my guiding principles, all benefited from this effort to modernize the Coast Guard. I'm very excited about where we are, and we will continue to embrace those principles of modernizing to make sure we're putting the best Coast Guard forward to support the nation.
Well, and we appreciate that. And just for my lack of really not knowing percentage-wise, you're going to have national security along the waters. You're going to have, obviously, storm response, rescue, and recovery. How would you categorize your three major areas that you guys work in? What three major are your top three areas? And put them in order if you can.
Yes, sir. I would say, first and foremost, as a component within the Department of Homeland Security, we're focused on the security of the nation, the national security, more specifically, the Homeland Security. We're a globally deployed.
Do you include storms in that?
Sir, I would say from a national security standpoint, storms clearly factor into that. I'd say number two, the economic prosperity of the nation. I mentioned the maritime marine transportation system. About $4.6 trillion of activity occurs in our 361 seaports, our 25,000 miles of coastline, our vast inland river system that you're familiar with. We enable that, whether it's the aids to navigation, it's partnering with the Army Corps, it's reopening those waterways. What I found after the storms of 2017, 2016, states with ports, the governors are on the phone with me or my field commanders in about 24 to 48 hours. When does my port get open? The flash to bang,
I remember.
product coming into LA, LB, it's about 3 to 5 days on the shelves of the Walmarts, the Target. So I'd say we're a critically key role there. Support to the Department of Defense, the national security roles. I mentioned support to 5 of the 6 combatant commanders on any given day. We've got Coast Guardsmen on Guantanamo Bay supporting the detention camp operations there on a persistent everyday basis. In the Middle East, on the Arabian Gulf, dealing with the Iran threats and the maritime security operations there. We're in the Arctic. We're asserting a, influence through presence. We are the only real U.S. government presence other than the Navy on an episodic basis up there on any kind of a routine basis. So it's about projecting sovereign presence.
Sure. Well, thank you, Admiral. We appreciate what y'all do and appreciate you coming in today.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. Chair will now recognize Ms. Plaskett for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and at this time I'll yield to Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the gentlelady for yielding. First of all, everyone, it's good to see you again. And as you probably are well aware, back in 1961, President John F. Kennedy was at an inaugural parade, and the Coast Guard was marching, and he looked out and said, "There's not one single black person." That was 1961. And the Coast Guard seems to have struggled with regard to diversity. I just want to know, and recently there have been a number of complaints with regard to discrimination and desperate treatment with regard to disciplinary action. As you know, a few years ago I spoke before the Academy because we were having problems then, again, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I'm sure you're well aware, because you did the invitation, that Congressman Benny Thompson, Congressman Courtney, and I are coming up to the Academy, I think it is in November, to again address the cadets. Just 2 questions. Tell me, how are we doing with regard to diversity in the ranks? How are we doing with diversity with regard to faculty? And how are we doing with regard, it's not just good enough to have nice numbers. What are we doing with regard to climate? You know, as you know, I sit on the Naval Academy Board of Visitors, and I've been there for now 12 years. And we have to work hard at diversity, but also at climate. And the other question would be, I want to know how we're doing with regard to women, because that has been a problem in the past at the Naval Academy and still is to some degree.
Congressman, good to see you this morning, and I welcome the question. Sir, I would say first and foremost, when you talk about discrimination in the service, I'd like to narrow that conversation to the Academy. I think that was your intent, sir. Okay. I would say, writ large, my guiding principles that hit the street on 1 June when I became the 26th Commandant spoke very overtly to the Coast Guard's need to be more representative of the nation we serve from the folks that you see in the Coast Guard, leading the Coast Guard. We have about 5% of our workforce is African American. That is insufficient. About 14.5%, 15% of our workforce is female. We have pockets where we're doing very well. The United States Coast Guard Academy Cadet Corps, which numbers almost 1,100, is comprised of 40% females. At some point, we turned the corner, you know, in the last decade plus, where women are in sufficient numbers there, where they are equally integrated. If that was a 60-40 split, women and men, I mean, I'm not sure where that goes, but there's a good story there. Underrepresented minorities at the Academy, we still have room to go. You know, you have my personal commitment, as is Mr. Thompson and Mr. Courtney, to support the Academy, work with the Academy. We have and continue to investigate any incidents of discrimination or racial bias up there and get after that, take action on that. We have created a task force that I get briefed on a routine basis about what we're doing up there to ensure the Academy. We talk about diversity, and that's the numbers, and you're right. Talking about the numbers, we had 18 African Americans that graduated in the class of 2018, most ever. That's a good news uptick. We had smaller numbers the year before, rivaling where we were in 1977. That's inexplicable in 2017. So we're focused on that, but it's really about inclusivity. We need the men and women of all walks of life to feel included. They need to be part of the Fabric Academy. The numbers need to come up where we get where we were with the women in terms of, you know, you look around and there's folks like you and they're succeeding. We need to make sure underrepresented minorities are graduating at the same percentages of their majority counterparts. In terms of writ large in the service, sir, we are underway, intending to wrap up late January or February with a women's retention study. We find retention of women trails, and I don't know the percentage, but there's a trail behind their male counterparts to some degree. We are not waiting till January, February to get after that. We're trying to tease out the findings. I've created what I call a personal readiness task force and assigning full-time handful of people to start understanding these challenges and start actioning these challenges, sir. So I think there's a good news story to say we're focused on it. I welcome yours, Mr. Thompson, Mr. Courtney's, interest. I welcome the chance to bring you to the Academy to be part of the conversation that says we're serious about this, we're getting better at this. The Coast Guard does not benefit. My intent, the Coast Guard's intent to be more representative of the society we serve does not fare well when there's articles that say the Academy isn't a welcoming place to people of all backgrounds. That just sets us back, sir, and we don't have time for that. So I would love to get you up there, and I appreciate your commitment to doing that, where we can say, hey, as you say, this is our watch, and we're going to better things on our watch. And I am personally invested in that, Congressman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, if I may ask this committee's indulgence that giving my time to Mr. Cummings, that on the next Democratic person, I may be able to ask questions.
Absolutely, without
objection.
Thank you. The chair will now recognize another former chairman, Mr. Young, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Admiral. Congratulations. You're my 10th Commandant. 10 presidents and 10 speakers. 10's a good number. I'm trying for actually 11th, so serve your full 4 years, and I'll serve 4 more. And those that don't like it, they can go do what with it.
Is the gentleman including his wife, Ann, in that list?
Pardon?
Are you including Ann in that list?
Oh, yeah, of course.
I'm just checking.
She's an officer. I'm not. I'm a private one. This is a strange question, Admiral, and you can't answer it right now, and then I have 2 other more serious questions. Of your $12 billion, and your budget, you say $12 billion, I want to report back from you how many lawyers are you employing now, and the amount of money spent from your budget in the legal field defending your agency against other agencies and the private sector. This is important to me because a lot of people forget it. I know personally when I first came into this office, you had very few lawyers. You got a shoving pot full right now. And I just wonder how much money is being spent because it takes away from, I think, the mission which we directed you to do. One of the things that I'm interested in, of course, is the port access route in the Chukchi Sea, the Bering Sea, and the effect upon Alaska natives up there, the sea resources and everything. What assets, mobile or fixed, does the Coast Guard have available to address the concerns raised by Alaska natives regarding the regions being unprepared for an oil spill response?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. On the first question on lawyers, we will take that and get back to you. What I will say, I'm speaking to the Judge Advocate Corps today, and what I will say, sir, is those lawyers absolutely enable our Coast Guard operations. Our missions have got increasingly complex, and I'm not defending the numbers, but we'll give you the answer on numbers. We'll give you the costs on that as soon as we can quickly turn on that.
Well,
regarding,
just stop right there. The reason I'm asking is just not you.
sir,
You have to defend yourself. It's a lot of other people doing this that take away from the mission and it counts against the budget, which we're trying to serve, you're trying to serve. And I'd like to put a stop to the whole thing because, very frankly, most of it's misspent money.
understand
I'm
your
prejudiced
concern, sir.
that way. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Sir, regarding the Chukchi, the Beaufort areas in Alaska, we've been operating through a framework where we've brought mobile capabilities up there, generally from about 1 June into October here. We've supported what we call Arctic Shield operations here this past year with 4 different cutters. We've forward operated 2 MH-60 Jayhawk helicopters to Kotzebue. We've worked, I think, upwards of almost 20 rescue cases. We've involved, engaged the local community on safety on the water, on oil spill response capability. We continue to do exercises up there across the range of our portfolios. There's obviously talk, discussion, I think more in the Army Corps lane than the Coast Guard lane about, deep water port type facilities in the future of the Arctic, and the Coast Guard potentially would derive some benefit from that. I don't believe we're the lead agency in those conversations, but we will continue to press into the Arctic. We're on the precipice of potentially a detailed design and contract award for a polar security cutter. First time we're talking about that conversation in more than 4 decades here. We're keeping the Polar Star, alive on life support to bridge that gap. But, sir, we will probably continue, not probably, we will, for the foreseeable future until we get that, that new polar security cutter or multiple new polar security cutters built, we will operate on this maritime capable platform type scenario.
All right. You have a very good reputation in the Arctic. I want you to know that, and which reminds me, in the Arctic, I would call it program, what role are you taking in? Is it the Navy? Is it Homeland Security? Is it the Coast Guard? Who's the head dog?
Well, sir, I think you may have seen Secretary Mattis was recently visited the Arctic and talked about, we need to pay more attention.
I'm aware of that, but
yes, sir.
What I'm worried about is there's a lot of talk. If something happens, are you in charge? Is it the Defense Department? Or is it NOAA? Or who runs the shop?
Sir, if we're talking about some type of a spill,
An oil spill, not necessarily that. How about a freeze-in? How about navigational aids? All that, is that still going to be on your jurisdiction?
I believe that defaults to your United States Coast Guard, sir. We have a leadership role in the Arctic. The Navy's there from a defense standpoint. The SecNav is interested. We are partnered with the Navy. We're partnered with the Navy through the Integrated Program Office on this icebreaker that's helping us drive down schedule costs, acquisition risk. We're partnered with NOAA and the Navy here as we look at, evolving mission requirements. But things like oil spills, things like rescue, sir, those are missions that are statutorily in our wheelhouse, and I believe that, we'll be the lead agency in that.
Do you have the Homeland Security and yourselves are working together, or are you looked as this lesser of those 2 agencies?
Specific to the Arctic, sir?
No, Homeland Security, the head of Homeland Security and yourselves. Are there good communications there? Are you able to establish your priorities, or is it Homeland Security?
Congressman, I would say we are a very good fit in the Department of Homeland Security. I was with the Secretary yesterday. I have great accessibility to her. She understands our challenges. We are part of the conversation of pushing our borders out. I believe there's a good fit. There's no perfect fit in the federal government for the Coast Guard because of our broad missions, but I think the right fit is DHS. We have great support from the department on this polar security cutter, the Secretary's personal interest, the staff's interest. I think things are very positive with our relationship with our parent department.
I know, Mr. Chairman, my time's up, but Admiral, keep in mind you have a big supporter here, and if you see someone trying to override your decisions concerning the seas, let us know, because sometimes they have a tendency to say, we're this and we're that, and you're little and you don't mean much. And I'm saying, you're the one that runs the seas. You're the runs the navigational aid, search and rescue, oil spill responsibility, immigration interdiction, the whole gamut, drug interdiction. And if you need help, let us know. We haven't funded you adequately. And one thing I will condemn Congress, we give you more responsibility, but we haven't funded you as we should, and it seems the money goes someplace else. So keep that in mind, and thank you for your service. Thanks for being the new 10th Admiral, Commandant I've served with.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Young. It is now my pleasure to recognize Ms. Plaskett again. You are now
Thank you.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commandant, for being here. I wanted to ask if you could provide an update on the current status of the Coast Guard's operations in the U.S. Caribbean. Specifically, if you could speak about the level of readiness and preparedness during this hurricane season. I know that you all did an excellent job in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico after Hurricanes Irma and Maria, and again after Florence. But how does the hurricane activities in other areas affect your preparedness for hurricane season and utilizing the lessons learned that you have now from the previous year?
Thank you for the question, Ms. Plaskett. I would assure you, ma'am, we are prepared for any type of a major storm, hurricane in Puerto Rico, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands. We have derived lessons learned from last year's, unprecedented hurricane season. We've fielded some new technologies aboard our Coast Guard rotary wing, our helicopters, called them Shout Nanos. We actually have greater visibility on where those helicopters are. Once we dispatch them out to a rescue or recovery mission, we can see that in our command centers. We've employed what we call Coast Guard OneNet, which is an enabling platform, technology platform that allows us to layer in different NOAA flood type predictions, other information. So we pride ourselves on being an alerting organization. We've pulled some things forward. With the support of the Congress and the administration, there's about $300 million going to Puerto Rico to reconstitute our facilities in San Juan. That is our key operational node to deal with our air station in Borinquen on the northwest side of the island. Both of those locations suffered some fairly serious damage to the operations, to the support functions, our healthcare center in Borinquen, our child care centers over in St. Thomas, our detachment there. That facility needs a major overhaul, but we're standing to watch in those facilities. Our men and women are there living in less than ideal situations. I have made a commitment to make sure, as it takes time to define a project, contract the project. Some of those challenges are even exacerbated in more remote locations like the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico or the U.S. Virgin Islands. So we want to make sure our men and women come into an adequate level of existence today, with the hope that in the coming years we will better those and get those places more.
So do you have a report that's been prepared on the lessons learned and how you're implementing those what you learned in the past? Is there some sort of document or something that you could share?
Congresswoman, we have internal, lessons learned type stuff. We could probably roll up something to your staff to tell you what are those things we pulled forward from the 2017.
That would be helpful. As you may know, I sit on Oversight and Government Reform, and we've requested I've requested, and other members have requested, and we had scheduled hurricane review with FEMA, but I think there are other agencies like yourself, as well as Army Corps of Engineers, that would really be beneficial to be a part of a hearing or a discussion like that, because I know how much you all worked in tandem with one another during those, and you all have really gotten, I think, a good handle on what went well and what didn't go well during that discussion.
Yes, ma'am. And on an annual basis across all those contingency operations, be it hurricanes, oil spills, as Chairman Young spoke about, we do about 700 annual exercises, exercising our area contingency plans, our security type plans.
Right.
I mean, we are learning, practicing organization that takes contingency operations very seriously. So
Well,
we'll be happy to get back to you on that.
moving outside of necessarily hurricane preparedness, but I know that in the past we've talked about the need for additional support, additional funding that I thought would be very beneficial to the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico because of our borders and the high level of drugs and other activity that are going on there. Do you feel that you're getting the funding? Will you be able to ramp that up? Has the cuts taken an effect on that as well?
Congresswoman, I think there's a good news story there. My last job as Atlantic Area Commander, I committed to surging, I believe it was somewhere 12, 13, 14 additional bodies to support security operations out of the Virgin Islands. Secondly, one of my early action items was to commit to standing up a base in San Juan. We have a sector command there. The sector has a logistics department. That's a complex operation, from the security threats, the downrange. That area spans from the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, essentially to the north coast of Venezuela. That is a large area. Captain King there has a full-time job just meeting his operational requirements. So we are standing a base up. We'll be putting bodies into that between now and the upcoming assignment season, summer of 2019. That'll be a better supported location for Coast Guard frontline operations with more capable mission support enablers.
Thank you. And one last thing is I really wanted to ask you here in this hearing and to your others that are on the bases, particularly in St. Thomas, that we have, and in St. John, that we have a real issue with regard to vessels and individuals who are mooring and living near our harbors and are not necessarily permitting. It's become an environmental issue as well for us. And as you're well aware, we have very scarce resources with our own local Department of Natural Resources being able to enforce that. And I know as a mandate, part of Coast Guard's mandate is in fact protecting the environment. And there are going to be real issues long term if we continue to have individuals living in the harbor without proper sewage and other facilities on those vessels. You know, you're really hard-pressed to go swimming in some of those places where once individuals like myself, when you were younger, were able to. So would love to have your support in being able to do that. Congressman,
we'll work with our local commander there, Captain King, at the sector, and look what we can do in our existing authorities. You know, things that fall under our Open 90 Oil Pollution Act of 1990 authorities in terms of remediation, environmental risks. We have authorities there. There's other places where we'd have to work in partnership with probably the government of the U.S. Virgin Islands to figure out what we could do collectively in partnership on those type of situations.
Thank you again, Ms. Plaskett. Admiral, there is interest in another round of questioning. I'm going to begin with recognizing myself for another 5 minutes. And I'd like to begin with some questions about immediate hurricane response in suburban and urban areas, what Mr. Weber has seen, of course, in Texas, what I've just witnessed in North Carolina, and what we've witnessed in other places where you're seeing these roads literally completely underwater, homes underwater, and the Coast Guard having to go out there and undertake life-saving capabilities in that kind of situation. You're not talking about an extremely large vessel that was christened and sent off into the rough seas. We're talking about small, flat-bottom vessels, teams of individuals that have to go out there around down power lines and down trees and livestock and so many other issues that are not necessarily always thought of when you're thinking about the Coast Guard mission. And so as it relates to that, I was wondering if you could speak just a little bit to, do you have the resources, the assets that you need in place for responding to hurricanes and situations like that, whether it's these small vessels, whether it's advancement in your drone program and being able to go out there and look beyond your line of sight to find individuals that are in peril. Can you speak a little bit to how that has advanced and what the benefits that you have seen just in these last couple of years with hurricanes as it relates to that, and if you see anything on the horizon that you think you have further need of in order to provide the adequate response? I would appreciate that, Admiral.
Congressman, thank you for the question, and there's a lot in that question. I would say at a macro level in terms of our response, an area of concern for me is the size of our Coast Guard reserves. At one point, years back, we had authority to go to 10,000 reservists. We never got above 8,100 reservists. Today, we're at about 6,300 plus or minus reservists. For something like Florence, even where we were in the 2017 hurricane season, we met mission there with that size reserve. But if this was a protracted, multi-month Superstorm Sandy in this scenario that went on for many months, or a Deepwater Horizon that went on for many months, in Deepwater Horizon, we would have had activated all 6,300 reserves today and then some, because we got almost up to 7,000 plus back then. So I'd say one area of concern for me is our reserve force. In terms of those flood punt teams, the shallow water capabilities you rode with the other day, those are low-cost things. We pull those teams in from all over. Our strike teams, Atlantic Strike Team, Gulf Strike Team, Pacific Strike Team, maintain those capabilities. Our 8th District, which is the heartland states, 23 states in the heartland have these to deal with high flooding along the Mississippi and the other major river arteries there. So we can pull those boats together pretty easily. We can go out and contract for those boats out of a Bass Pro Shop. I mean, as long as we do that legally. I can take deployable specialized force folks, our high-end operators that are assigned to maritime safety security teams, and I can pull them from all over the country to operate those boats with a very short ramp-up. So I think we have bandwidth and capacity and capability there, and those folks have shown their ability. You know, Harvey was 12,000 people rescued, 11,000, almost 12,000 rescued, a lot from the air, but equal or more from the water on those inland capabilities on those flood punt teams. You saw us fly a small drone. Our R&D center is doing some innovative things on how do we bring, you know, off-the-shelf capabilities like small drones out to surveil areas to make us more effective, more impactful. We're partnered up. I think what you get with the Coast Guard that really is part of our special sauce is the ability to work with the locals, with the states, support FEMA, support the governors, and we really speak that jurisdictional, you know, multilingual language. We can plug in from a town with one sheriff, and we're a named member of the national intelligence community, so we work across that. In the recent response, we were lashed up with the 1st Air Force. After Admiral Bushman's team was talking to them, had this been a different storm, had it been a high wind, high impact, you know, thousands of people in distress from the word go, DOD had the large amphib offshore, they had the Arlington offshore, they had, you know, V-22s on board to fly in, MH-60 helicopters. There was a lot more capability that you didn't see that was ready for a different type of response. The Air Force had put search and rescue crews around the perimeter area to support the Coast Guard and other agencies. So I think we're well positioned, sir. I don't think there's any, you know, large needs, but I tell you the one thing is the reserve force. I will come back to this committee and anytime I'm on the Hill and talk about my concerns about getting our reserve force up near the authorized, I think it's 7,100 today or 7,000 today. We need to get closer to that number, sir.
I appreciate your response. I would absolutely welcome your return to speak very specifically about that reserve force. It's vitally important across all branches of our military. I began my career in the reserve force, and so I'm familiar with it on the Army side of the house. But it's in that I will now recognize my friend, Mr. Garamendi, for another 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd love to get into the GAO report on the what we now call the polar security cutters. I think I'm going to like that name, but I think I'm going to let it go. The report came out very recently. I understand there's discussion about doing a specific hearing on that, and so I'll wait that. Just generally, your view of their report, are we still on track, taking into account their positions or their recommendations? Just quickly, are we okay?
Ranking Member Garamendi, I would say I believe we are okay. We welcome GAO's interest. We welcome GAO's recommendations. We have not built a large icebreaker, what we're now terming a polar security cutter. Before it was a heavy icebreaker. Polar security cutter, I think, is a little bit adaptive to the nature of the work. It's a competitive space. I mentioned SecDef before, talking about, you know, cooperating where we can, compete where we must. I think the Arctic's a competitive space, sir. I believe we are in a good place. The technical inputs have come in here in August. We're looking at those. Cost inputs will come in November. This is an ongoing dialogue. Because it's a void there for decades when we haven't built this type of ship, we need to continually enhance our knowledge. I mentioned earlier in my comments and one of the questions about working through this integrated project office with the Navy. You know, the Navy builds more big ships. This is going to be a large ship. This is going to be a big acquisition. So we're deriving benefit from the Navy's interest, the SecNav's interest. I think that does drive down cost, schedule, performance risk. 2023 is aggressive. My predecessor said, you know, we're behind. I've coined the phrase 631, a minimum of 6 icebreakers, a minimum of 3 being heavy polar security cutters, and the 1 is 1 now. We're chasing this space, this need in the Arctic.
You've answered my question. You're on it.
We're on it, sir.
We'll have a hearing in due course here, and we'll get into it in significant detail. There's another set of ships that we've not built for a long time. Program currently called Inland Waterways Western Rivers Tenders, which we're now going to call Waterway Commerce Cutters, which is a much better name. We appropriated $1.1 million to get started on this program. There's $5 million in the upcoming fiscal 2019 budget. Where are we with this? I understand the captain that was responsible for the program has moved on to other tasks or retired. It's a priority. It's a priority, and that this is the commerce of the United States in the inland waterways and beyond. So bring us up to date.
Ranking Member Garamendi, thanks for that question. The Waterways Commerce Cutter is going to get after replacing a fleet of 35, kind of a hodgepodge, small river tenders, 75 feet pushing barges, 160-foot construction tenders, a wide range of vessels. We're excited about that. And one piece you left out was actually the 2018 omnibus injected $25 million additional dollars on top of the 1.1. So we got $26.1 million last year. That signals loud and clear to me that the Congress is interested in this vessel. It ties to that $4.6 trillion economic engine annually on our waterways. So we're on this, sir. We're in the acquire phase of the acquisition. We're looking and talking to the Army Corps, other users about what technologies we can pull forward. We recognize the desire to do this expediently. I've got ships in that class, or those classes, that are 72 years old. The Smilax is the queen of the fleet. 72 years old. The average age of that fleet is 5 decades plus, 50-plus years. I traveled on the Sangamon on the outside St. Louis in my previous capacity, and the cook was wearing double hearing protection and a helmet because there's so much vibration as he made the crew their meal. So we owe it to our sailors to recapitalize those vessels as soon as possible. There's a great new story here. We're building national security cutters. We're getting ready to award on the OPC here imminently. Fast response cutters, polar security cutters, waterways commerce cutters. We have not been in this position before, sir, but your signal, your interest in this is absolutely clear on me. Our acquisitions workforce is stretched, but they understand my expectation is we're going to deliver this ship to the waterfront as soon as possible.
Very briefly, I'm concerned about the teamwork that's going to be necessary, the integration of your best people into the design and then ultimately the construction of these ships, as well as the advice and counsel of the folks that are on the river already, not only from the Coast Guard, but you mentioned the Army Corps of Engineers. Good. I'd be interested in hearing from you, your design team, what kind of a group you're going to put together to manage this, as well as to bring into the process the best thinking of folks that are intimately familiar with the tasks beyond just the Coast Guard.
Yes, sir, Congressman. We have, I think we've issued 2 requests for information, RFIs. I believe one was back in the early part of this calendar year, one was closer to this summer, to draw out exactly that, those expertise, those lessons learned. This is not a, I'm loath to put a number out, but I think you're talking a $25 million plus or minus ship. This is not, as we're talking about OPCs and NSCs, I think we've got to be reasonable in our requirements. You know, we have to build a ship that's purposeful to operate on the inland waterways and do the type of work it does. And there is a lot of, the Army Corps has a prototype. They're sailing out of, I believe, out of St. Louis. We're going to derive the learning from that. And there are other waterway users, sure, that we absolutely, through our mature acquisitions process, want to draw the best knowledge out there. And we want to get after this. And to do that quickly, that's by looking and, you know, drawing from others that are experts in this field.
If you could report back on a status, I yield back my time.
Thank you again,
Yes, sir, we will.
Mr. Garamendi. I am now going to recognize Mr. Weber for another 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Admiral. I want you to talk about, if you have the numbers, and if you don't, that's fine. When it looks like we're going to get a Department of Defense bill across the line, we're hoping today, and a lot of some of our appropriation bills at least. But when we don't, when we're, what's the word, hampered by a CR, a continuing resolution, what does that do to the Coast Guard?
Congressman, thanks for the question. I guess I would say, and maybe it's a bit cynical, but we've been hampered by CRs here almost 40% of the time here in the last 8 or 9 budget cycles. So we've gotten adept at that. What does it do to an agency, an operating agency like the Coast Guard? It strains that. We we have the ability to put our uniform members, those civilians that conduct frontline operations like a search and rescue controller in a rescue coordination center like Houston that you visited, or a watchstander or the vessel traffic service, a civilian there that's supporting frontline operations, we can bring them to work under a CR or a government, under government shutdown in extreme cases. But what we do lose is, if it's a shutdown, we lose those supporting folks that enable frontline operations. So we can do the operations, but things like scheduled maintenance, training, those things fall by the wayside. CRs preclude us from starting new projects at the beginning of the year. So a year ago when we had a CR, we were getting ready to do a service life extension program on our MH-60 Jayhawk helicopters, and you saw just how critical those helicopters were to the Harvey response in Houston, over in your Beaumont, Port Arthur area. We had a lot of helicopters doing a lot of important things for Texans there. And, deferring those projects like that, SLEP, any amount of time, that just sets us back a little bit, sir. So there is a consequence, and we work around it, but ideally, having a budget at the start of a fiscal year makes us the most capable organization we can be.
Do you have a dollar amount in difference for your funding, or those numbers you didn't bring with you?
Congressman, I'd have to get back to in terms of, there is probably some, loss inefficiencies that come from operating under CR that I'd probably want to bring back to you here in a follow-on if I could.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. We do appreciate what y'all do with what you have, and appreciate your service. Thank you, Admiral. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. If there are no further questions, I would thank Admiral Schultz for this testimony. Thank all the members for their participation. Before we close, I would take this opportunity to thank Captain Nolan for his detailed work in writing this review. We appreciate that, and it is absolutely recognized here. I would now ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers in writing to any questions that may be submitted to the Coast Guard, and unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. The subcommittee stands adjourned.
Well done. First time out.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that.